When people think of Henry VIII's offspring, they often imagine the merciless Bloody Mary or the magnificent Elizabeth I. However, there was another child whose short reign exposed a darkness that even his infamous father might have found unsettling. Eddie VI, known as the Boy King, ascended the throne at the age of 9 and transformed from an apparently innocent youngster into one of England's most authoritarian rulers. His demise was so twisted that it cast a shadow over the entire Tudor dynasty, indefinitely. The tale you are about to hear is not merely about a sick child dying young. It reveals how absolute power can utterly corrupt, even when held by a child. What you will learn about Eddie's final days will challenge everything you believed about the Tudor legacy. The year was 1537, when Henry VIII finally obtained what he had longed for desperately: a legitimate male heir. Eddie's birth sparked celebrations throughout England as the answer to decades of dynastic uncertainty. However, his arrival came at a gruesome price. His mother, Jane Simmons, died only 12 days after childbirth, leaving the infant prince motherless and making him all the more precious to his increasingly distrustful father. From his earliest moments, Eddie was treated less like a child and more like England's destined savior, surrounded by guards, tutors, and courtiers who constantly reminded him of his sacred fate. This isolation from ordinary childhood experiences laid the foundation for many troubles to come. The process of shaping a ruler unlike his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who both endured their father's anger and rejection, was unique for Edward. Unlike them, Edward only received praise and admiration. Henry VIII, possibly feeling remorse for how he treated his daughters, lavished his son with attention and love that almost seemed like worship. The young prince was provided with the most exceptional tutors money could afford, though these instructors were not ordinary. They were progressive Protestant theologians deliberately selected to transform Edward into the ideal Protestant sovereign. From the age of 6, Edward was engaged not only in learning Latin and Greek, but also in studying detailed theological works exposing the supposed evils of Catholicism and defending the divine right of Protestant kings to rule without challenge. The education arranged by Henry VIII for his son resembled indoctrination more than traditional schooling. Edward's chief tutor, John Chase, was not only an outstanding scholar, but also a religious zealot who filled the boy's mind with the idea of England as a new Jerusalem, cleansed of Catholic corruption. Every subject, be it history, philosophy, or governance, was taught through the perspective of Protestant dominance and absolute monarchy. By the time he turned 8, Edward could confidently recite intricate theological arguments explaining why Catholics deserved death and insisting that opposing his future reign was the same as opposing God. What made Edward's upbringing especially perilous was the combination of intellectual depth with radical religious fervor. Henry experienced complete emotional seclusion while engaging in theological discussions with university scholars. He never interacted with other children or formed typical human bonds. His only companions were grown-ups who treated him with great respect. This upbringing produced a boy who could grasp complex political ideas but lacked understanding of human compassion or the significance of individual life. This harmful mixture of extraordinary intellect and emotional deficiency shaped every part of his future rule. In the fall of 1547, England was governed by a 9-year-old boy raised to believe he was God's chosen representative on earth. Eddie VI took the throne after his father Henry VIII passed away, inheriting not just a crown, but a nation fractured by religious conflicts. The young monarch had been educated by the most extreme Protestant tutors Henry could find, men who filled his mind with dreams of religious purity and absolute control. Unlike his elder sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had witnessed their father's fury personally, Eddie had been protected, praised, and told since birth that he was meant for greatness. This deadly blend of divine right and childish stubbornness would cause suffering for thousands of his people. Edward's England was a ticking bomb of sectarian strife. His father had severed ties with Rome and created the Church of England, yet the country remained sharply split among Catholics, moderate Protestants, and others. Radical reformers dominated Edward's Regency Council, which was headed by his uncle Edward Simonds. The Duke of Somerset at first appeared to promise measured leadership, yet the young king had his own vision for how England should be governed. From his very first meetings of the council, Edward displayed a disturbing blend of childish petulance combined with cold calculation. He frequently interrupted seasoned advisors to lecture them about Protestant beliefs. What amazed observers at the time was how swiftly the 9-year-old monarch began asserting his power. Within weeks following his coronation, Edward took it upon himself to review death penalties personally and showed an unsettling eagerness for executing those he considered heretics. Court documents from this era portray a boy who treated life and death decisions like academic exercises, debating theological grounds for punishments with the same dispassion he might use discussing Latin grammar. Witnesses recalled that Edward would often smile while signing death warrants, seeming pleased with his own ingenuity in finding scriptural support for every execution. The initial months of his reign were characterized by what courtiers privately referred to as religious outbursts, furious episodes whenever anyone proposed moderation in religious policies. Edward had absorbed his tutor's teachings so deeply that he truly believed any compromise involving Catholic rites amounted to personal betrayal of Christ. Henry's advisor once proposed permitting certain Catholic nobles to practice their faith privately. Eddie, however, is said to have hurled his inkwell at the man and yelled that God would punish England for such softness. Initially, these episodes were brushed off as mere childish tantrums, yet they actually exposed the emergence of a dangerously zealous religious fanatic. Perhaps most unsettling was Eddie's apparent absence of typical childlike interests. While other boys of 9 amused themselves with toys, Eddie devoted his spare hours to reading detailed reports of the Spanish Inquisition, meticulously noting interrogation methods. His attendants discovered sketches in his chamber illustrating various torture practices, all accompanied by Eddie's own commentary on how effective they were at forcing confessions from heretics. The child who should have been learning to ride horses was instead studying the cruelest techniques to break both bodies and wills in the name of his Protestant vision. What made Eddie truly perilous was the blend of his religious zealotry and his royal power. Whereas his counselors schemed behind the scenes, the young monarch absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with chilling eagerness. He kept precise records of his reign, and these journals unveil a boy who found pleasure in accounts of executions, religious oppression, and the torment of those he branded as heretics. By the age of 10, Eddie had personally become writing sermons that were spread throughout churches all over England, sermons urging the total removal of Catholic influence and warning of divine retribution for anyone showing kindness to heretics. The young king's harshness went beyond religious issues. Eddie displayed a spiteful nature that surprised even the most experienced courtiers who had served his merciless father. When servants made mistakes, Eddie would create complex punishments that appeared intended more to shame than to teach proper conduct. One unlucky page who spilled wine on Eddie's documents was made to stand in the courtyard for hours, while courtiers threw spoiled food at him, all under the direct orders of the 11-year-old king. Eddie observed these humiliations with evident delight, often taking notes on how the victim reacted as if carrying out scientific research. The boy king's diary entries from this time reveal a mind growing more disconnected from typical human feelings. Eddie described the suffering of others with the same emotionless tone he used to talk about the weather, recording details of pain and fear as if they were mere data points rather than misfortunes. When a kitchen maid died after being whipped on Eddie's command for allegedly practicing Catholic prayers, his sole recorded response was to note that the punishment was more effective than expected in preventing the servant from committing future errors. Eddie's behavior clearly showed a cruel temperament that extended far beyond religious concerns. The way he treated his own family arguably revealed the clearest sign of his increasing sociopathy, despite his upbringing. Raised alongside his sisters during early childhood Eddie showed no genuine affection for Mary or Elizabeth once he took the throne. Instead, he regarded them through the same religious perspective he applied to all his subjects. Mary was seen as a dangerous Catholic who needed to be controlled or eliminated, while Elizabeth was considered a possible ally because her Protestant leanings made her somewhat more acceptable. For Eddie, family bonds were purely political strategies. This change became even more obvious when Eddie's uncle Thomas Seymour tried to gain his favor through gifts and flattery. Rather than being moved by kindness, Eddie perceived Thomas's gestures as attempts to manipulate him and answered with cold calculation. When Thomas was arrested on charges of treason, Eddie not only backed his execution, but reportedly observed from his window as the man who had once been kind to him was led to the scaffold. Witnesses stated that the young king displayed no emotion when the axe fell, instead jotting down notes in his journal about the effectiveness of various execution methods. As Eddie approached his 12th year, his authoritarian traits grew much stronger. The boy who had once seemed fragile and bookish began to exert direct control over government decisions, frequently overriding the advice of his counselors. When he sensed that his approach was too lenient, his Protestant reforms became increasingly harsh, with compulsory church attendance maintained through extensive networks of informers and strict punishments for any divergence from the accepted beliefs. Eddie personally created a system of religious monitoring that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition, urging neighbors to spy on one another and even encouraging children to report their parents' religious offenses. The king's fixation on control reached into every corner of English religious life. Eddie issued comprehensive rules not only regulating public worship, but also private prayers, specifying exactly how people should pray, what beliefs they must hold, and even dictating their thoughts about God. Disobedience to these rules was considered an act of treason against both the monarchy and the divine. Penalties ranged from public shaming to imprisonment and execution. The young monarch personally examined each case, frequently increasing punishments because he felt the initial sentences did not demonstrate enough fervor for Protestant purity. Eddie essentially formed a group resembling thought police, urging subjects to inform on their neighbors' religious behaviors and offering rewards for successful accusations. The young king found satisfaction in reading these reports, often calling the accusers to court to provide further details about those they accused. Those accused of Catholic leanings faced imprisonment, torture, or even death. The young king himself reviewed the cases and frequently intensified the punishments suggested. Eddie's court transformed into an environment where paranoia and zealotry thrived, and compassion was viewed as a sign of frailty. The system of oppression that Eddie established was striking for its thoroughness and the monarch's hands-on role in overseeing it. Unlike mature rulers who might assign such tasks to others, Eddie insisted on examining each case, carefully analyzing the allegations against every individual. He often designed specific penalties aimed at what he considered their unique religious mistakes. His diaries from this era resemble guides to religious oppression, filled with intricate debates on which punishments were most apt for various kinds of heresy. What made Eddie's campaign of persecution especially disturbing was his blend of youthful inventiveness with deadly seriousness. When conventional punishments fell short, the adolescent king would create novel forms of disgrace and torment, always justified by complex theological reasoning. One Catholic priest who refused to abandon his faith was compelled to parade through the streets of London wearing a sign declaring him an enemy of Christ, while children hurled stones at him. All of this happened under Eddie's direct orders. The king witnessed this event from his palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's agony while dictating notes to his secretary. His fixation on religious purity extended even to his own family, demonstrating a total absence of natural affection. Eddie regarded his half-sister, Mary, a committed Catholic, not as kin, but as the greatest danger to his Protestant realm. In private correspondences that have survived, Eddie expressed a hatred that was both immature and terrifying, labeling her as a bastard and an adversary of Christ while plotting ways to declare her illegitimate or even have her executed for heresy. The boy, who should have felt brotherly love instead, nurtured fantasies of witnessing his sister's execution by fire for her faith. Eddie's animosity toward Mary went well beyond political strategy and appeared to consume him personally with such intensity that it alarmed even his most extreme advisors. The young monarch spent countless hours devising methods to lawfully remove Mary from the line of succession, conferring with Protestant lawyers eager to justify what was essentially familial murder. Court witnesses observed that Eddie's demeanor would darken whenever Mary's name arose, often withdrawing to his chambers to compose lengthy treatises on the theological necessity of excluding her. The boy king's schemes for dealing with Mary revealed a troubling blend of fanaticism and personal vendetta. Managing Mary became increasingly intricate and harsh. Eddie devised detailed plans for Mary's apprehension, trial, and execution, including specific accusations of heresy and treason. He even composed what was supposed to be Mary's confession, compelling her to abandon Catholicism and admit to her illegitimate birth before granting her the mercy of a swift death by beheading instead of burning. These papers, kept in the royal archives, display a mind that had gone well beyond ordinary political rivalry into true sociopathic hatred. Eddie's approach to Elizabeth was more complicated, yet equally unsettling. Although he supported her Protestant beliefs, he primarily regarded his younger sister as a tool to advance his religious objectives rather than as family. Eddie intended to use Elizabeth's future marriage to strengthen Protestant alliances, disregarding her personal happiness as insignificant compared to the political benefits her union could bring to his cause. Even his fairly positive sentiments about Elizabeth were colored by his religious fixations, making it evident that his sister's worth to him was solely functional. The king's failure to develop normal family bonds extended to his wider court life, too. Eddie viewed his nobles, advisors, and servants not as people with their own value, but as chess pieces to be manipulated according to his religious and political aims. Those who had served him loyally for years could suddenly find themselves cast aside with no warning. Those who failed to demonstrate sufficient zeal for his increasingly radical policies often faced rejection or even execution. Devotion to Eddie demanded total obedience to his vision of a Protestant England, leaving no space for individual conscience or ethical doubts. When Eddie started showing signs of severe illness in early 1553, his conduct grew even more unstable and ruthless. Instead of softening as death approached, the 15-year-old monarch became fixated on guaranteeing that his Protestant reforms would outlast him. He understood that Mary's rise to power would restore Catholicism, and this realization pushed him toward more desperate actions. The thought that his life's mission might be undone by his Catholic sister filled Eddie with fury bordering on insanity. This rage led him to consider options that would have alarmed even his oppressive father. His worsening health only seemed to fuel his extremism rather than lessen it. Physically feebler, Eddie's religious zeal intensified, as though he aimed to cram a lifetime of Protestant cleansing into the few months he had left. Physicians at court noted that his illness came with episodes of fervent preaching, during which he uttered disjointed sermons insisting on the complete removal of Catholic influence, even at the cost of killing every Catholic in England. Initially, these outbursts were dismissed as fevered delirium, but Eddie's clear moments suggested a chilling determination behind them. It became clear that his harsh declarations came from sincere motives rather than delusions caused by illness, Eddie began. He secretly met with radical Protestant figures who were plotting a takeover that would bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant relative, Lady Jane Grey. The conspiracy that unfolded was astonishing in its boldness and brutality, involving schemes to detain or eliminate both of his sisters and place a puppet government controlled by Protestant zealots. The 15-year-old king, despite his fragile health, threw himself into these gatherings with a passion that stunned and alarmed his fellow plotters. The details of Eddie's last conspiracy showcased the depth of his change from an innocent youth to an aspiring despot. Working alongside John Chase Dudley, the Duke of Northland, Eddie devised a scheme that would have led to the deaths of both sisters and the creation of a stricter Protestant regime than England had ever witnessed before. The plot included plans for large-scale executions of Catholic aristocrats, confiscation of all Catholic estates, and the introduction of a lasting religious enforcement agency to oversee all facets of English life. Eddie's active role in orchestrating these horrors was meticulous and eager. During his final days, the dying king composed lists of Catholics destined for execution, estates to be taken control of, and laws to establish his Protestant utopia. His handwriting grew more intense as he focused on these ambitions. Due to his illness, his handwriting was unsteady as he filled page after page with plans that amounted to religious mass extermination. The boy who once appeared to be an innocent pawn in political schemes revealed himself as the mastermind behind a plot that would have made the Spanish Inquisition seem merciful in comparison. However, Eddie's sickness had a cruel irony that felt almost like divine punishment for the horrors he intended to unleash. Modern medical studies indicate that the young monarch suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and what was probably arsenic poisoning, likely administered by his own doctors in a misguided effort to cure him. This irony did not escape the notice of those around him. The king who had spread religious hatred across England was slowly being poisoned by those attempting to save his life. As the toxic substances gradually ruined Eddie's body, he suffered hallucinations and bouts of insanity, which his courtiers interpreted as divine visions. The boy who had shown no compassion to others endured his last days in extreme agony, his body racked by pain as he gradually wasted away. The court physicians observed that Eddie's suffering seemed to amplify his religious zeal, offering no spiritual relief, but instead fueling his mental obsessions rather than cleansing them. The way Eddie died was especially chilling for those present. The doctors documented that his body began to give off. Several weeks before his passing, a terrible stench filled the air, and his skin took on a sickly green hue, signaling severe poisoning. Eddie's hair and fingernails started falling out, and he endured fierce convulsions that left him momentarily paralyzed. Once admired as one of Henry VIII's most striking children, the boy had turned into a disturbing likeness of his former self, his body seemingly fighting against the deadly poison consuming him. Perhaps the most unsettling part was that the king remained clear-headed enough to realize his declining condition, spending his last days shifting between agonizing screams and feverish tirades about Protestant martyrs. Eddie's final lucid moments did not focus on peace or mercy, but rather on his sorrow that he would not live to finish purifying England as he had envisioned. The dying monarch pleaded with his co-conspirators to continue their plan without him, assuring them that God would bless their loyalty in creating his Protestant utopia. The young king's last hours were a grim mockery of a typical deathbed scene. Rather than seeking pardon or expressing love for his family, Eddie spent his final breath condemning his Catholic sister Mary and praying that God would protect Protestant England from her perceived evil. Witnesses said his last words were filled not with tranquility, but with bitterness, fitting for a life seized by religious obsession and political extremism. When Eddie finally passed away on that fateful day, his death marked the end of a tragic, tumultuous reign. On the 6th of July in the year 1553, the sense of relief among the king's courtiers was deeply felt, though few dared to voice it openly. The young monarch who had promised to save England instead turned into a source of terror for the nation and for himself. His passing was seen as the sole way out from the harsh policies he had pursued that threatened to plunge the country into civil conflict. Even his closest allies privately accepted that the death of Eddie might have been a blessing for England, though no one would speak such thoughts aloud. The days following Eddie's demise exposed how entirely his intricate schemes relied on his personal power. When the king's resolute will was absent, the conspiracy fell apart rapidly as moderate Protestants abandoned what they now viewed as a radical plan. Lady Jane Grey, the woman set to benefit from Eddie's plot, found herself isolated, as nobles, who once appeared devoted to Protestantism, suddenly claimed urgent obligations elsewhere. Mary's rise to power garnered support not only from Catholics, but also from moderate Protestants, alarmed by the dangers of religious fanaticism revealed under Eddie's rule. The boy king, who had hoped to be England's fiercest Protestant hero, instead left behind a legacy marked by cruelty and the widespread relief that followed his death even among loyal followers. Protestants found themselves embracing Catholic Mary as a better option compared to the ongoing governance by Protestant radicals. The irony in Eddie's tale goes far beyond his unsuccessful plans for succession. The young monarch, who had been so fixated on eradicating Catholic influence, unintentionally reinforced it through his extremism. His harsh treatment of moderate figures within the Protestant community resulted in English Protestantism being controlled by zealots who drove away regular worshippers rather than drawing them in. By the time he passed away, many English Protestants began to see Catholicism as a haven from the increasingly severe demands of Eddie's form of Reformed faith. Modern scholars have started to reconsider Eddie Simmons's rule, and the resulting portrayal is much bleaker than the traditional story of a frail boy controlled by ambitious counselors. Legal documents and private letters disclose a young ruler with a genuine enthusiasm for persecution who exhibited troubling signs of taking pleasure in the suffering of others. Eddie's direct role in orchestrating executions and his meticulous diaries describing torture techniques imply that England was governed for 6 years by what can only be described as a child psychopath with boundless authority. The progression of Eddie from innocent youth to ruthless despot provides unsettling insights into how absolute power corrupts, unlike experienced adult leaders who one might expect some degree of empathy or political shrewdness to endure. Eddie's utter detachment from ordinary human connections and his absolute conviction in his own divine right generated a perfect storm of cruelty. The boy who had never heard the word no and believed that defying his will was literally sinful became capable of acts so brutal they stunned even the harsh Tudor era. Reports from that time indicate that Eddie's courtiers grew increasingly alarmed by the young king's conduct, yet felt powerless to control him. The very doctrine endorsing his reign also rendered any resistance equivalent to blasphemy, leaving even his closest counselors helpless to temper his mounting harshness. The young ruler had fashioned a governance where his smallest desire instantly became law, and his escalating appetite for cruelty faced no restraint beyond death itself. Perhaps the most terrifying question is what could have unfolded if Eddie had reached adulthood. His vision for a Protestant England involved establishing a permanent religious police, completely removing Catholic aristocrats, and building a surveillance network that scrutinized every detail of his people's private lives. The teenager who passed away in 1553 had already started applying these measures on a limited scale, and there is every reason to believe that a grown Eddie would have fully realized such a regime. Among the most brutal regimes in history, the legacy of Eddie VI stands as a stark reminder that evil can arise from unexpected places, and that noble goals can be twisted by unchecked power and religious zealotry. The young king, convinced he was rescuing England's spirit, nearly destroyed the nation itself. His death might have been the kindest act his rule could offer his people. His tale serves as a cautionary message about the perils of merging absolute control with unwavering ideology, particularly when held by someone too young to grasp the full impact of their decisions. Eddie's narrative also highlights the perilous mix of youth, power, and ideology. While adult despots may be tempered by political concerns or personal ties, his total solitude and firm belief in his own virtue pushed him to conceive horrors that seasoned politicians found appalling. The child who should have been engaged in play was instead orchestrating widespread executions and religious purges, viewing human lives as expendable in pursuit of spiritual purity. This young king's reign also reveals how education can slip into indoctrination when it lacks balance and empathy. Eddie's instructors shaped an exceptional theological mind, but they also created a moral monster, a person capable of devising complex intellectual defenses for cruelty while lacking true humanity. Henry never acquired basic human compassion, and his story acts as a cautionary tale about the risks of any educational system that values ideological rigidity more than simple human kindness. Ultimately, Eddie the King's short rule remains one of history's most unsettling examples of how authority can spoil innocence. The boy who started off as Henry VIII's beloved successor ended as a terrifying figure whose death was welcomed by his own people. His change from a protected youth into a potential despot exposes harsh realities about human nature and the specific dangers brought by those convinced their cruelty serves a noble cause. The passing of Eddie VI was not merely the conclusion of a life, but the closure to what might have become the darkest chapter in England's history. The young king's final suffering, filled with pain and resentment toward his own family, stands as a fitting end to a reign that had held such promise, yet delivered only dread. By dying prematurely, Eddie VI arguably did his greatest service to the country he wished to rule, saving England from the full realization of his horrific ambitions.